You're listening to Warwickshire Wildlife Trust's podcast from the Hideout Bird Hide at Brandon Marsh Nature Reserve. I'm your host, Bob Hockenhall. The Planning and Infrastructure Bill is going through Parliament. Labour has said it'll create the biggest building boom in a generation and help deliver its target to build 1.5 million homes and 150 major infrastructure projects by the end of this Parliament. But the rhetoric coming out of Parliament is alarming many people who fear the bill will be a licence to trash nature. With me to discuss this is Warwickshire Wildlife Trust Chief Executive Ed Green and Ian Jelly, Director of Landscape Recovery. So Ed, if I can ask you first, in terms of nature, what are the implications of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill?
This is a piece of legislation that determines what happens when stuff gets built to the natural environment in the place that it gets built. So we're all used to houses going in, industrial estates being built, any sort of construction going on, and the people behind that, the developers, being obliged to pay for new roads, traffic calming devices, schools, infrastructure, GP surgeries. Now, everybody listening to me say that will be thinking, well, I can think of a case where that hasn't worked very well. But we don't challenge the assumption that people who build stuff have to put in the infrastructure behind the development and have to make good some of the damage that they create. And this is just the nature equivalent to that when stuff gets built, inevitably harm gets done to wildlife at that location where the development is taking place. And this is the law that set out the obligations of the commercial interest behind that development to make good the damage they're doing to wildlife.
And I know many people and many wildlife trusts have concerns about the changes, and you yourself took a petition down to London. Just explain to us, both of you, why we should be concerned about the changes that this bill would bring.
At the moment, given the laws that we currently have, they were introduced under a piece of legislation called the Environment Act that was passed in 2021, so the previous government. Broadly speaking, and I'm simplifying things here somewhat, when harm gets done to the local environment, the developers have to make that good and then give benefit of 10%. There are various ways that have been set up to measure the harm that gets done, and their obligation is to make good the harm and improve it by 10%, but critically at the point where the damage is done. So if you live next door to a development, if you live next door to a housing estate that gets built and that causes significant harm to your local environment, you know that the developers are obliged to pay the costs of making good that damage and then making it a little bit better. The draft legislation that we've got before us now changes that. Again, oversimplifying a really quite dry and complicated subject, the developer can just write a cheque and then walk away from the obligations that they currently have.
And how do you feel about that, Ian?
This is a fundamental change to the way in which nature is protected in this country, which could erode the existing protections for nature. And now is the time to do something about it. So we're at potentially, it's not an exaggeration to say, a generational tipping point here, where if people don't stand up for nature and give nature a voice and enable the government to see sense on this, we will be past the point of no return, where the legislation is passed and we then live in a world where the circumstances change that Ed has highlighted.
If the bill is passed, though, developers will have to pay into a nature restoration fund. Is that not showing that the government does care about nature?
Who can argue against a nature restoration fund? What a beautifully titled pot of money that is going to be. But the problem with it, as the government is proposing, is that developers can pay into it, then walk away. There is no guarantee, as things stand, that that money will be spent making good the damage at the location that it was done. We're speaking here to the people who live in Warwickshire, Coventry and Solihull. The damage could be done here, the payment could be made into the Nature Restoration Fund, but that money could be spent in Yorkshire or Cornwall or Suffolk, miles away. And while as committed environmentalists, Ian and I want to see the habitats and the environment in Yorkshire, Cornwall and Suffolk improved, we don't want people who've experienced loss in Warwickshire to have to get into a car and drive for 3 hours to go and experience it. So that's the main problem with it now. There's secondary problems as well, is that the administration of that pot of money is going to be the responsibility of a government agency called Natural England. Natural England, like so many of our public authorities, are really stretched, they're under-resourced, and it's very questionable as to whether Natural England are going to have the capacity and the capability to administer a pot of money that could be expected to be receiving many, many millions of pounds.
Just to add to that and to illustrate the point further, this isn't about NIMBYism, because ultimately it affects the whole of the country. So it's not about us not wanting houses built in Warwickshire. It's about making sure that the system works for nature as well as for people. So in a scenario that is sort of presented under the current plans for the government, you could see a situation whereby if you were listening to this podcast and you moved into a new house, that new house might have been built on a wildflower meadow. So that wildflower meadow has been destroyed in order to build the house that you're living in, and no protection for that wildflower meadow is in place because the legislation has been removed. And in the current system, that would result in mitigation and a localised solution for nature and uplift elsewhere in your local area. But in the new situation that the government is proposing, that money would go into a pot and be invested somewhere else in the country, like Ed talks about. So not only are you living in a house that has been created on land that used to be good for nature, there's been no local benefit to nature. And that's not just for Warwickshire, that could be wherever you're living in any house in any part of the country. So it's fundamental to the new system that it's designed in a way whereby local betterment can be delivered in link to the development that's occurring. Otherwise, you are faced with a scenario whereby nature is sort of prioritised in certain parts of the country at the expense of others. And we know that that's not great for nature and it's not great for people, because nature needs bigger, better, more joined up areas in order to be able to move around. And also people need nature where they live. And we can't have a situation where nature lives in other parts of the country and people live in isolation from it.
You've talked about nature where people live. What do you actually mean by that?
Well, obviously everybody lives in a different circumstance. So you might live in a block of flats, or you might live in a terrace house, or you might live in a detached house. But we can all imagine, and we've been through places where there is just nature all around you. There might be the mature trees down the side of the street, hedgerows that are full of birds nesting. There might be a local park just around the corner. Some people have gardens associated with their houses or community green spaces. These are the things that are designed in at the stage of a development that often are parts of legislation required in order to be able to create it. A developer building a certain number of houses will be required in the current set of legislation to provide some green space for the community living there. If we move into a world where that nature legislation is eroded and disappears, the requirements for developers to do that sort of thing is reduced, and you might have housing estates and areas where people live in the future where there is no provision for nature. And ultimately then nature is in decline, and the people that live there have a lower quality of life.
And given what you've said, I suppose we could end up with a two-tier system of some counties that are doing fantastically for nature and others that are seeing nature decline rapidly. Is that what you,
yes,
in a nutshell, what your fear is? Yes.
We could end up with parts of the country being denuded, stripped of wildlife, having their environment trashed, and other parts of the country where the environment is being nurtured through the funds that are being taken from the development that's occurring elsewhere. Great if you happen to live in the latter part of the country, but if you live in the former, if you live in Warwickshire, Coventry, Solihull, and you're seeing your nature being trashed, then you're experiencing the very real result of living in a poorer environment. Your health is getting worse. Maybe your properties are great at risk of flooding because the natural ecosystems that were soaking away the water are no longer there. If you're running a health service in those parts of the country where the local environment is deteriorating, well, then you're picking up the costs of people's ill health, not being able to get out into the outdoors in the way that they've been used to be. All the costs are occurring in some places, but all the benefits are hundreds of miles away.
We live in a world where everything is interconnected. This is a system. The world operates in a system whereby nature forms a part of that system and enables us to adapt to climate change, the extreme weather events that were happening at the moment around the world. increased rainfall events of high velocity, extended periods of drought, higher temperatures, all of those things, nature can play a role in mitigating and addressing. But if you are marginalising nature to parts of the country where people aren't living, then the benefits that nature can provide to society, as well as the nature in its own intrinsic value, are lost. So the government has its own requirements to help the country adapt to the climate emergency and the challenges we're going to face in the years ahead. Nature has to be critical to that, and by isolating nature at the side of the country or in areas where it's prioritised where the people aren't, is ultimately going to make it more expensive and have greater economic impacts, because we're going to have to design in solutions that are more expensive than natural solutions. Nature can provide a hugely cost-effective benefit to reducing health waiting times, to help improving all sorts of different public services that nature provides. But it can't do that if we've eroded it in the areas where people live.
The question that's going to be in front of everybody who lives in our part of England is that, well, there are a number of questions. So the average price of a house in Warwickshire last year was £355,000. That's data from Rightmove. That's really expensive. It's in everybody's interests to bring the cost of housing down. But people, while needing and wanting to afford better priced housing, really need to ask themselves what sort of quality of local environment they want to live in. Is it okay to have a cheaper house if your local environment has been ruined in order for you to get the house at that price?
I know there is a lot of rhetoric in the media around this at the moment about nature versus growth, bats and newts versus building. They always talk about newts, stopping developments. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, let's take that head on, shall we? Labour, in opposition, made great play of the country needing 1.5 million new homes. And they have come into government promising to build 1.5 million new homes. There is planning permission already in place for 1.4 million homes. So virtually their target. Now, clearly, bats and newts didn't prevent any of that planning permissions from being awarded. So where's the problem? The Wildlife Trust, we've done a piece of research. We've analysed planning appeals, and we know that in 97% of cases, planning appeals don't mention bats or newts. So again, it's something that's been made up, that in the political heat around this particular highly contentious issue has been cooked up as a bit of a smokescreen and a bit of a convenient scapegoat. Nature is not the reason that houses are not being built in this country. There are other reasons that are politically and pragmatically much harder to tackle: skills shortage, and also how to incentivise developers who are sitting on this land bank of planning permission to actually start building at a scale that is going to reduce the unit price of the thing that they're selling.
Do you think nature and growth, wildlife and development can go hand in hand? And if so, how should that be done?
So the Wildlife Trusts work with housing developers, we work with the farming industry, we work with countless industries to enable nature to be embedded into what they already do. So we're not against growth, we're not against housing development, we're not against food production. But ultimately, society and all of us need us to live in a world that is sustainable. The resources that we have on this planet are finite, and once they are gone, they are gone. So we need to be able to live our lives and economically develop the country in a way that is possible for future generations as well as our own. And so from our perspective, it's not a choice between development or growth and wildlife, and it's not a choice between food production and wildlife. Those things can go hand in hand. The critical thing is finding a way where they do go hand in hand, so that nature can recover, because ultimately we are one of the most nature depleted countries on earth. And we're also facing a climate emergency. And those two factors place a huge strain on society, both for now and in the generations to come. This government really has an obligation on the citizens that it serves to create a world where the UK can continue to thrive in the years to come, and not make short-term decisions that ultimately are going to cost more money and restrict growth in the longer term.
And you've got some good examples from Orbit Housing, haven't you, about this?
Yeah, so we work with Orbit Housing, who are a social housing provider. They actually came to us and said that they recognised that there was a climate and nature emergency and they wanted to do more. So we talked to them about how they manage the land around their houses, and we helped them design a way in which they could reimagine the outdoor green space and manage it more effectively for nature as well as people. And that's a great example because it looks at each housing area in its own right and considers how people use the land in that area. We can't turn every piece of land into a nature reserve because some areas are used for kicking footballs about or walking the dog or the exercise. But other areas, actually, there's no need to manage them intensively in a way that the housing company used to do. So Orbit have been open-minded because they can see the benefits to their residents for that. Bringing nature into where those people live, closer to their communities, makes people happier and healthier, improves the well-being of the residents of Orbit, and helps them play their part in helping nature recover. So there are great examples like that and others where we're working with housing developers. We're not a shut door. We want to see a society where we can develop a way where everybody can benefit, both wildlife and people.
Those of us in the environmental movement are not naive enough to believe that people do not, or that this country and our society does not need development. We all live in houses, we all enjoy what development gives us as a society. But we are realistic enough to realise that we can't do without nature either. Okay, we can't destroy the thing that keeps us alive in order to give us the things that we want and the things that we enjoy out of society. So we have to strike a balance. There is no if, buts and maybe. We can't destroy our life support system.
And I'm sure a lot of people will agree with you on that. They may feel that they want to make a difference and ensure that nature and growth go hand in hand. So what would you advise them to do?
We would advise them at this particular moment in time to make their views known to the MPs. We have already seen that even in the early stages of us voicing our concerns around this piece of legislation, that people are willing and able and ready and really want to respond. We've got 30,000 people who have already contacted their MPs. We need many, many more. Labour, your local MP and the key ministers behind this, Rachel Reeves and Angela Rayner, really need to hear the voice about what people truly believe. So if anybody listening to this podcast is wanting a channel to express their opinion, then they can go onto our website, they can use the tools that are there that will take what they believe directly to their MPs with a copy to the ministers in local government. So we're not telling anybody to do anything other than make your voice known. If you have an opinion on any of this stuff, speak up now, because when that housing estate or that factory gets built next to where you live, it'll be way too late.
Ed and Ian, thank you very much. You've given us a lot of food for thought there. Very interesting views, and thanks for coming along.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Warwickshire Wildlife Trust's podcast with me, Bob Hockenall. If you'd like to find out more about the Trust, visit our website at warwickshirewildlifetrust.org.uk.